The Zumwalt-class destroyer is the most misunderstood ship in the United States Navy, and it is misunderstood in a specific way that matters to this story. The misunderstanding comes from the program's public narrative. The cost overruns the reduced procurement from 32 ships to 3, the headlines that described it as a billion-dollar failure. The public narrative is not entirely wrong about the numbers. USS Zumwalt, DDG 1000 cost approximately $4.4 billion to build. That is a real number, and it is uncomfortable. What the public narrative consistently misunderstands is what $4.4 billion bought, because what $4.4 billion bought is something that cannot be understood from budget documents or procurement disputes. It can only be understood by watching what happens when a Plan Type 052D destroyer tries to classify it on radar in the Taiwan Strait and gets back a contact return the size of a fishing vessel. The tumble-home hull, the distinctive inward-sloping sides that give the Zumwalt its angular, almost Art Deco profile, is not an aesthetic choice. It is the physical consequence of designing every surface of the ship to return radar energy away from the receiver rather than back toward it. Conventional warships have a radar cross-section measured in thousands of square meters. The Zumwalt has a radar cross-section measured in the range of a small fishing boat, depending on the aspect angle. The advanced gun system, the deck house, the mast arrangements, every element of the ship's external geometry has been designed with the specific goal of making the ship look to a radar like something it is not. It is a destroyer. It looks like a trawler. The people who designed it think this is very funny. The planned surface warfare officers who are currently trying to figure out what they are looking at think it is less funny, and that difference in perspective is broadly the operational point. USS Zumwalt, DDG 1000, commissioned in 2016, is making 12 knots on a northeast heading in the Taiwan Strait, approximately 55 nautical miles from the Chinese coast and 42 nautical miles from the Taiwan coast. The time is 8:17. She is conducting a freedom of navigation transit that the U.S. Navy has been conducting through this strait, the 110-mile wide body of water between mainland China and Taiwan, with the regularity of a scheduled service since the 1990s, and with elevated frequency since 2022. The transit has been filed with the appropriate maritime authorities. The transit is lawful. The transit is also, this particular morning, being conducted by an asset that the plan has spent considerable analytical effort trying to characterize and has not yet fully succeeded in understanding at the operational level that a credible interdiction plan would require. The Planned Tactical Operations Center at Zhoushan received the notification that a U.S. Navy destroyer was transiting the strait at 7:45, 32 minutes ago, derived from the routine maritime surveillance picture that the People's Liberation Army maintains over the strait continuously. The notification did not specify which destroyer. The identification of which specific Arleigh Burke or other hull is transiting is a routine exercise for the plan's maritime surveillance architecture, which maintains a library of U.S. Navy vessel signatures and normally classifies a transiting destroyer within minutes of first contact. This morning, the classification is not happening on the normal timeline. The surface search radar picture is showing a contact in the strait that correlates with the notification's position, but does not correlate with any known hull signature in the threat library. The contact is the right size for a large vessel, approximately, but the radar return varies with aspect in a way that the plan's classification algorithms are not confident about. The watch team at Zhoushan has been working the classification for 27 minutes and has produced 4 different probable hull identifications, all of which the system subsequently rejected when the contact aspect changed and the return profile no longer matched. This is unusual. The watch supervisor at Zhoushan has escalated to the duty officer. The duty officer has escalated to the Operations Center Commanding Officer. The Operations Center Commanding Officer has made a decision that the planned Strait Operations Doctrine calls for when classification confidence is insufficient. Send a ship. The Type 052D that is now making 26 knots toward USS Zumwalt's position was at anchor in the approaches to Zhoushan Harbor. The transit time from her anchorage to a position that will allow visual identification of the contact is approximately 41 minutes at 26 knots. The planned commanding officer at Zhoushan has 41 minutes to get a visual on whatever is in his strait, making 12 knots northeast. Aboard USS Zumwalt, the bridge team and the Combat Information Center are watching the Type 052D depart Zhoushan at 26 knots on an intercept course. The Spy-3 multifunction radar. The Zumwalt's primary active radar system, which differs from the Spy-1D and the Arleigh-Burke in its operating frequency and its physical integration into the deckhouse, rather than its mounting on a mast, has been tracking the Type 052D since she got underway. The Tactical Action Officer has the contact data. The contact is classified within 4 seconds. Type 052D, planned destroyer, Zhoushan homeport. The Zumwalt can classify the 052D. The 052D cannot classify the Zumwalt. This asymmetry is the operational situation in one sentence. The commanding officer is on the bridge. He has reviewed the intercept geometry. He has reviewed the transit track. He has noted the 41-minute timeline to the Type 052D's arrival at visual identification range, and he has noted that USS Zumwalt will be well north of the 052D's intercept geometry in 41 minutes at 12 knots. He has also noted that the transit track's geometry, if maintained, will bring the 052D to a position approximately 1.2 nautical miles off Zumwalt's port beam before Zumwalt clears the intercept window. 1.2 nautical miles is visual range in the Taiwan Strait's October morning visibility, which is to say, the Type 052D will get a visual identification on whatever is in the strait, regardless of what the radar says, and the Type 052D's crew will then spend approximately 30 seconds processing the fact that the angular Art Deco destroyer they are looking at from 1.2 miles is not what their radar has been telling them it is. This is the vulnerability window, and it is not the kind of vulnerability window that this series usually produces. The ship is not constrained. The ship is not limited by a maintenance cycle. The ship is not in degraded sensor mode. The vulnerability is this. For a specific window of approximately 20 minutes, from the moment the 052D gets visual range to the moment the geometry takes it past, USS Zumwalt's primary tactical advantage is going to be visible to 2 sets of human eyes on a planned bridge wing, and the photographic documentation that those eyes produce is going to update the plan's understanding of the Zumwalt's visual profile in a way that close-range imagery from a satellite cannot. There is a subtler layer to the vulnerability window that the commanding officer has considered, and the electronic warfare officer is currently working through below decks. Once the 052D closes to visual range and identifies the Zumwalt correctly, the plan's targeting databases and the Type 052D's own fire control systems will have a confirmed association between the unusual radar return they have been tracking and the specific visual hull profile of DDG-1000. The plan will know what a Zumwalt-class destroyer's radar return looks like. They will know the cross-section profile at the specific aspect, angles the 052D will observe this morning. They will update their classification library. The next time a Zumwalt transits the strait, the classification lag will be shorter. This is real. It is not hypothetical, and it is the kind of strategic intelligence product that a 26-knot transit from Zhoushan Harbor is worth producing, even if the 052D gets back nothing else from this morning's intercept. The commanding officer has been briefed on this. He has accepted it. It is the operational cost of transiting the Taiwan Strait in a $4.4 billion ship that the plan cannot currently classify on radar. The transit was authorized at every appropriate level. The cost was assessed and accepted. The transit continues at 12 knots northeast on track. Let us talk about the plan. Type 052D's experience of this morning from their perspective Because the human element of the mismatch is where the humor in this story lives, and it is the kind of humor that is earned by the specific absurdity of the situation. The watch team on the Type 052D has been running their classification system against the Strait contact for 41 minutes. They have had 4 confident classifications rejected by their own system. They have had the classification escalate from the watch team to the watch supervisor, to the operations center commanding officer, to the order to get underway. They have crossed 26 nautical miles at high speed to resolve a classification problem that their technology cannot solve from the distance it is designed to work at. And now, at 8:47, as the Type 052D comes to a matching course at 1.3 nautical miles off the port beam of the contact, the commanding officer of the 052D is standing on his bridge wing with binoculars, and he is looking at USS Zumwalt. What he is seeing: a destroyer. Unambiguously, a destroyer. The size, the armament, the antenna arrangements visible at this range are consistent with a large surface combatant, and no amount of reduced radar cross-section changes what a 610-foot warship looks like when you are 1.3 nautical miles away from it in good visibility. But the hull form. The hull form is not any hull form in the plan's visual library of U.S. Navy destroyers. The inward-sloping sides, the flat, angular surfaces, the distinctive deckhouse profile. These are visually distinctive in a way that the angular, almost science fiction aesthetic of the Zumwalt communicates before any of the other details register. The commanding officer is looking at a ship he has not seen before. He knows it is American. The hull number is visible at this range with binoculars, DDG 1000, and the U.S. Navy jack on the bow is unmistakable. He does not know what DDG 1000 is. His operations officer, who has joined him on the bridge wing, is looking at his tablet, running the hull number through the plan's surface vessel database. The database returns a match for DDG-1000 within 30 seconds. USS Zumwalt, Zumwalt-class guided missile destroyer, commissioned 2016. San Diego home port, advanced gun system, reduced radar cross-section design. The operations officer shows the commanding officer the result. The commanding officer looks at the database entry. He looks back at the ship. He looks back at the database entry, which includes the design notes that explain the hull form. He looks back at the ship. He has the expression of a man who has just understood why his classification system spent 41 minutes being wrong. On the bridge of USS Zumwalt, the officer of the deck is watching the 052D through the bridge windows. The 052D is at 1.3 miles, matching Zumwalt's course and speed in the standard plan escort position. She is close enough to observe clearly. She is close enough that the digital camera on the 052D's bridge wing is clearly visible to USS Zumwalt's own optics. The officer of the deck notes the camera. She notes the commanding officer and operations officer, visible on the 052D's bridge wing with binoculars. She makes a log entry. Type 052D in close parallel escort. 1.3 nautical miles. Visual identification range. Crew conducting photographic documentation. Her expression is the expression of someone who has been briefed on exactly this scenario and is watching it proceed, exactly as briefed. On the weather deck, USS Zumwalt's own intelligence petty officer is running a camera of his own. The Type 052D at 1.3 miles in good morning light, matching course and speed, is providing excellent photographic documentation of the 052D's current external configuration, antenna arrangement, mast equipment, visible deck hardware, the condition and arrangement of her weapon systems. This is the standard documentation protocol for any planned vessel that closes to visual range during a strait transit. Both ships are photographing each other. The symmetry of the situation is not lost on the petty officer, who notes in his documentation log that the 052D appears to have 2 officers on the bridge wing using binoculars and at least 1 camera operator. He notes the hull number of the 052D. He notes the time. He continues his documentation. Below decks on USS Zumwalt, the electronic warfare officer is having a productive morning. The SLQ-32V5, the Zumwalt's upgraded electronic warfare suite, with improved collection capability compared to the earlier variant, has been monitoring the 052D's radar emissions since the ship departed Zhoushan Harbor at 26 knots. The 052D's Type 346A phased array radar has been in active mode throughout the transit to the strait, and the SLQ-32 has been collecting the Type 346A's emission profile continuously for the past 41 minutes at close range. This is not new collection. The Type 346A is well characterized in the threat library from previous encounters. What is new is the specific collection opportunity that the 052D's desperate 41-minute sprint created. The radar's emission behavior, while searching for a reduced cross-section target at medium range, in the specific mode the 052D's operators selected when their classification algorithms failed and they needed to search the target's bearing more aggressively. They switched to a high PRF search mode at 0803. The electronic warfare officer reports to the tactical action officer. That is not the mode they use for a normal classification sweep against a standard contact. They went to high PRF because they could not classify the contact at standard mode, and they were trying to improve their resolution. He marks the mode transition timestamp. High PRF against a reduced cross-section target tells us the threshold at which their classification system fails. The return was too ambiguous for standard mode at this range. That is a measurable characteristic of the ship's cross-section. He adds this to the collection record. The mode transition at 803 is itself an intelligence product. It tells analysts the approximate range at which the Zumwalt's reduced cross-section degrades the Type 346A as classification confidence below the threshold for standard mode operation. This is the kind of collection that cannot be produced by laboratory analysis or satellite observation. It requires the plan to actually try to classify the Zumwalt and fail in a measurable way, and the Type 052D has provided exactly that failure in detail across 41 minutes of transit time. They also increased their pulse rate when they closed inside 2 miles, the EW officer adds. Consistent with a fire control mode for surface engagement, he pauses. They were not preparing to engage. This is a standard ranging function that their fire control radar runs when it achieves a track on a surface contact. But the mode gives us the fire control radar's range measurement behavior against a target with our specific cross-section. He marks the timestamp. The fire control mode behavior is logged. It tells analysts how the 052D's targeting system would behave in an actual engagement scenario against a Zumwalt-class vessel. This is, by any reasonable assessment, one of the more valuable pieces of tactical intelligence the Zumwalt program has collected in its operational life. The SLQ-32V5 collection on the 052Ds, Type 346A, during the sprint phase. 41 minutes of continuous emission data, including 2 mode transitions that reveal the classification and fire control behavior of the system specifically against a reduced cross-section target, will produce a collection report that the Zumwalt Program Office at PMS 500 in Washington has been specifically requesting since the class entered operational service. The report will run to 24 pages. The executive summary will note that the Zumwalt's reduced cross-section functioned as designed, degrading the 052D's classification confidence sufficiently to trigger a 26-knot emergency sprint and a visual identification evolution that, in a contested environment, would represent a significant operational advantage. The 24 pages will also note the Type 346A mode transition data as a priority intelligence product for the Air and Missile Defense Radar Program and for the Joint Electronic Warfare Planning Community. The Type 052D maintains its escort position for 43 minutes as USS Zumwalt proceeds northeast. The 052D's commanding officer has resolved his classification uncertainty. He has documented the encounter. He has transmitted a report to Zhoushan that includes the visual identification, the hull number, and the EW officer is confident. the 052D's radar performance data against the target. The plan will update their classification library. The next Zumwalt transit will see a shorter classification lag. This is the operational cost that was assessed and accepted. It is real. It is also from the Zumwalt program's perspective, accompanied by 24 pages of Type 346A collection data that the plan does not know they provided, and the 24 pages are operationally more valuable than the visual identification is strategically costly. At 9:14, the Type 052D reduces speed and falls back from the escort position. USS Zumwalt has cleared the principal classification uncertainty zone and is proceeding toward the northern end of the Strait transit lane. The 052D makes a wide turn and sets a course back toward Zhoushan. The SLQ-32 tracks her departure. The departure radar emissions are also logged. The 052D's radar switched back to standard search mode as the Zumwalt's range increased and the classification problem was resolved. The mode return data is a further data point on the classification threshold geometry. The EW officer notes it and adds it to the collection record. The commanding officer of USS Zumwalt is completing his situation report at 0924. The report covers the transit, the 052D classification delay, the intercept geometry, the visual identification evolution, and the collection results. It is precise and professional. It notes that the planned Type 052D required 41 minutes of active classification effort and a 26-knot emergency departure from anchorage to identify the Zumwalt visually. That the classification failure produced 3 specific and valuable collection opportunities: the mode transition data, the high PRF search behavior, and the fire control ranging mode against a reduced cross-section target, and that all 3 have been documented in the collection report accompanying the situation report. He does not note in the official report the expression on the face of the 052D's commanding officer when the operations officer showed him the database result. The official report does not include expressions. The official report is precise and factual. The expression, however, was noted by USS Zumwalt's own camera documentation, which caught a clear image of the 052D's bridge wing at 8:47, at a range where facial expressions are not legible, but posture is, and the posture of a commanding officer who has just understood why his classification system spent 41 minutes failing is distinct in the way that postures communicating sudden comprehension are always distinct. The image will be in the photographic package that accompanies the collection report. The photographic analysts will note it. It will not appear in the executive summary. Now let us discuss what the Chinese Ministry of National Defense said about this morning. The Chinese Ministry of National Defense released a statement at 1400 Beijing time, approximately 5 hours after USS Zumwalt cleared the northern end of the strait. The statement described a U.S. Navy warship conducting a provocative transit through the sensitive waters of the Taiwan Strait in violation of China's sovereignty claims, and described the People's Liberation Army Navy as having responded with appropriate maritime rights protection activities. The planned vessel involved in the operation, described as having monitored and accompanied the American vessel, had demonstrated the PLA's capacity to respond to American provocations in Chinese-claimed waters. The language was confident and used the specific vocabulary of the rights protection doctrine that has characterized Chinese maritime communications about Taiwan Strait transits for years. The statement did not describe the 41 minutes of radar classification failure. It did not describe the 26-knot emergency sprint from Zhoushan Harbor. It did not describe the expression of comprehension on the bridge wing at 8:47. It described monitoring and accompaniment. Both occurred. The framing of what they required to occur is where the statement and the collection record diverge. The defense correspondent who covers Chinese military affairs for a Western news organization reported the statement with the standard context. China monitors U.S. Navy transits of the Taiwan Strait, PLA, vessels conduct rights protection activities. Both sides claim the other is the provocateur. The correspondent noted that the specific vessel involved in the U.S. Navy transit was the USS Zumwalt, described as a stealth destroyer, and that the encounter had occurred without incident. The correspondent did not have the collection report. The correspondent did not have the mode transition timestamps. The correspondent did not know that the plan's classification system spent 41 minutes failing in a measurable and documented way that told the Zumwalt program office in Washington everything it had been waiting to know about how the Type 346A performs against a reduced cross-section target. Aboard USS Zumwalt, the intelligence petty officer is completing his photographic documentation package. 287 photographs of the Type 052D at close range, in good morning light, documenting the ship's current external configuration. The antenna arrangement on the 052D's aft mast appears to include a new piece of equipment that the Zumwalt program's imagery analysis has not previously documented on this hull class. The petty officer flags the observation in his documentation notes. The flag will trigger a review by the planned Surface Fleet Modification Tracking Program, which maintains the running assessment of external configuration changes across the plan order of battle. If the mast antenna is a new system, the Modification Tracking Program will want to know when it was installed and on which hulls. One photograph, flagged by a petty officer who's been doing this long enough to know what does and does not match the baseline configuration, potentially triggers a multi-week analytical effort that updates the threat picture for the entire 052D hull class. This is the detail work that does not appear in the situation report. It does not appear in the executive summary of the 24-page collection report. It appears in the photographic package transmittal note, in a single line flagged for priority review. It is the kind of detail that accumulates over years of straight transits and produces the most detailed picture of an adversary's surface fleet that any navy in the world maintains. Every transit adds a layer. Today's layer includes 41 minutes of Type 346A mode behavior, 24 pages of electronic warfare analysis, and one flagged antenna on 105-2D's aft mast. The Taiwan Strait is 110 miles wide, and USS Zumwalt transits it at 12 knots and arrives at the other end, having added another layer. The commanding officer picks up his coffee at 9:31. It is from the pot made at 8 o'clock, which is appropriate, because the 8 o'clock pot was made by the Combat Information Center watch supervisor, with the professional thoroughness that good watch supervisors apply to coffee making, and a coffee made at 8 o'clock by a thorough watch supervisor is still acceptable at 9:31 in the way that a coffee made at midnight is not still acceptable at 2:47. He drinks it. The Taiwan Strait is behind USS Zumwalt. The Pacific Ocean is ahead. The collection is transmitted. The 052D is back at Zhoushan. The plan's classification library has a new entry. The Zumwalt program office in Washington has 24 pages it has been waiting for since 2016. The classification library update is real. The 24 pages are real. The $4.4 billion is also real. Of the three, the commanding officer finds two of them entirely satisfactory. Bye for now.